The desert sun hammered down on the dunes of Varellon Prime like a blacksmith's fist on molten steel. Heat shimmered in the air, warping the horizon into a mirage of bleeding colors. Inside a hastily erected triage tent, canvas patched with synth film and staked with vibro rods, Corporal Jaren Vale sat on an overturned supply crate, peeling open a ration pouch with his teeth. The seal gave with a hiss, releasing the familiar, slightly stale aroma of protein mash and rehydrated greens. It wasn't gourmet, but after 3 days of skirmishes along the Iron Scar, a jagged canyon system that had become the front line between the Terran Alliance and the fractured Kesari Dominion, it tasted like victory. Sweat beaded along his brow, trickling down his temple and vanishing into the dust that clung to everything. His boots, his fatigues, even the stubble on his chin. He'd just taken his first bite when the tent flap parted. A medic ushered in a figure wrapped in a dusty thermal cloak, head bowed, one arm held stiffly against her ribs. The medic gave Jaren a quick nod. She's non-combatant. Found her near the eastern ridge. Might be shock. Watch her while I prep the dermal Regan unit. Jaren wiped his mouth with the back of his glove and stood. Sure thing, document. The figure didn't speak. She lowered herself onto a cot near the corner, the cloak slipping slightly to reveal violet skin the color of twilight storm clouds and a cascade of white hair that fell past her shoulders like frozen moonlight. Her eyes, large, almond-shaped, and the soft gold of ancient brass, flickered toward him before returning to the floor. She looked exhausted, not wounded, though a faint purple bruise darkened her jawline, and her left hand trembled slightly. Jaren hesitated, then walked over. "Hey," he said gently. "You okay?" She didn't answer, just shook her head once, the gesture so small it was almost invisible. He crouched down, keeping a respectful distance. Up close, he noticed the fine silver tracery along her temples, bioluminescent markings common among high-caste Kesari. Most of the ones he'd seen in intel briefings were bold and geometric, but hers were delicate, almost floral. He'd never seen anything like it. "You're hurt," he said, more statement than question. Still silence. But this time, her golden eyes met his, and something unreadable passed through them. Weariness, yes, but also a sharpness, a quiet intelligence that made him feel like he was being gently dissected. Jaren scratched the back of his neck. "Look, I've got extra. Not much, but better than nothing, right?" He held out his ration pouch. It was the last one in his pack, but the woman looked like she hadn't eaten in days. For a long moment, she simply stared at the pouch, then at him. Then, slowly, she reached out and took it. Her fingers brushed his, cool, smooth, and surprisingly strong. She didn't thank him, didn't say a word. But as she brought the pouch to her lips and took a small, careful sip, her shoulders relaxed the tiniest fraction, and Jaren felt an odd warmth bloom in his chest, completely unrelated to the desert heat. Outside, the distant thunder of artillery rolled across the dunes. The war had been going badly for both sides. Varellon Prime was a desolate rock, but it sat on the only stable wormhole nexus in the sector. Whoever controlled it controlled the flow of reinforcements, supplies, and escape routes. The Terrans called it the last door. The Kesari called it something untranslatable that roughly meant the breath before the end. Either way, everyone was fighting like it mattered more than life itself. Jaren sat back on his crate, watching her eat. She did so with an odd grace, even in the middle of a battlefield triage tent surrounded by groaning soldiers and flickering emergency lights. There was something regal about her silence, something that made him feel like he should be standing at attention rather than slouched with his boots unlaced. "You got a name?" he asked after a while. She paused, the pouch halfway to her lips again. "Lyra," she said finally, voice low and melodious, like wind chimes in a quiet garden. "Jaren," he offered. She nodded once. "Jaren." They lapsed into silence again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Outside, the medics rushed in another wounded soldier, a Kesari, judging by the violet blood staining his uniform. Lyra's gaze flickered toward the entrance, then away. Her expression didn't change, but Jaren noticed the way her knuckles whitened around the ration pouch. Over the next few hours, the tent filled and emptied with casualties. Lyra remained on her cot, saying nothing, but her eyes missed nothing. She watched as Jaren helped the medics lift stretchers, as he handed out water canteens, as he knelt beside a whimpering Terran private and told him stupid jokes until the boy stopped shaking. At one point, a Kesari prisoner spat at a medic. Without hesitation, Jaren stepped between them, holding up a hand. He's hurt, he said evenly. We don't kick people when they're down. Not here. The prisoner glared, but the fight drained out of him. Lyra watched all of it, her golden eyes unreadable. When night fell, the temperature plummeted. The medics had moved most of the stable patients to a hardened bunker nearby, but Lyra hadn't been cleared to leave. Jaren tossed her his thermal blanket. She caught it, studied it, then wrapped it around her shoulders without a word. You always this quiet? He asked, half joking. You always this kind? She countered, her voice softer now. He shrugged. Kindness doesn't cost anything. She looked at him for a long time then, as if weighing that statement against something heavy in her mind. Finally, she said, most soldiers I've met think it's a weakness. Then they're stupid, Jaren said simply. Compassion's the only thing that keeps us human when everything else tries to turn us into monsters. A faint smile touched her lips, just the ghost of one, but it lit up her whole face like a sunrise over snow. The next morning, a Kasari patrol appeared on the ridge. Not hostile, at least not yet. They carried white signal flags woven with silver thread, a sign of parley. The Terran commander, Colonel Voss, ordered Jaren to escort Lyra to the command tent. She might be a scout, Voss grunted, or a spy. Either way, keep your hand on your sidearm. Jaren glanced at Lyra, who walked beside him with her head high and her expression serene. She didn't look like a spy. She looked like someone who had seen empires rise and fall and was tired of both. In the command tent, the air was thick with tension and stale coffee. Holographic maps flickered above the central table, showing troop movements and orbital projections. The Kasari delegation entered 3 armored warriors, faces obscured by visors, their cloaks bearing the sigil of the Dominion High Command. But they parted instantly as Lyra stepped forward. And then, something strange happened. The lead warrior dropped to one knee. The others followed. Even the Terran officers instinctively straightened, though they clearly didn't understand why. Lyra turned to Jaren. Wait here, she said softly. Then she walked toward the center of the tent, removed her cloak and stood tall. Gasps rippled through the room. Her simple tunic was gone, replaced by a form-fitting ceremonial robe the color of deep amethyst, stitched with constellations that seemed to shift as she moved. Around her neck hung a pendant, a single, glowing crystal that pulsed with soft violet light. The silver tracery on her temples flared briefly, illuminating intricate patterns that hadn't been visible before. Colonel Voss paled. By the stars, it's her. Jaren's stomach dropped. Who? The Empress Lyravis, someone whispered. The woman he'd given his lunch to, the quiet, bruised, exhausted stranger, was Lyravis, sovereign of the Kasari Dominion, architect of the Celestial Concord, and the single most powerful being in the known galaxy. She commanded fleets that could blacken the sky, legions that had never known defeat, and a council of planetary governors who would kneel and weep at the mere mention of her name. And Jaren had offered her a squished ration pouch like she was just another refugee. He felt like crawling under the command table and never coming out. But Lyravis turned back to him. Her golden eyes found his instantly, and something in them softened. She raised a hand, and the room fell utterly silent. Corporal Jaren Vale, she said, her voice ringing with authority yet strangely gentle. You fed a stranger without question. You showed mercy where others saw only an enemy. You treated me not as a ruler, but as a person. She stepped down from the dais and approached him. The entire room held its breath. In my court, advisors speak in riddles, generals scheme for glory, and diplomats trade lies like currency, she continued. But you gave me your last meal and asked for nothing in return. Jaren's mouth was dry. I didn't know who you were. That's precisely why it mattered, she said, and for the first time since he'd met her, she smiled fully warm, genuine, and dazzling. She turned to the assembly. The Kasari Dominion will withdraw from Varellon Prime. Effective immediately. Shock exploded through the tent. But your radiance, one of the Kasari generals protested. We are on the verge. I said now, Lyravis said, her voice like tempered steel. This world is not worth another drop of blood. Let the Terrans keep their door. We will open another. Colonel Voss stared, dumbfounded. Empress, you would just leave? I would, she said, because one man reminded me that peace is not weakness. It is the hardest victory of all. She turned back to Jaren. Walk with me. Outside, dawn was breaking over the dunes, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. The battlefield, so brutal just hours before, now seemed hushed, expectant. Lyravis walked beside him in silence for a while, the sand whispering under their boots. "I wasn't always this," she said suddenly, gesturing to her regalia. "I was born on a farming moon. My parents grew lumberries under twin suns. When the Dominion found me, because of this," she touched her temple markings, "they took me away, said I was chosen. For years I was trained to rule, to command, to never show doubt, never show need." She looked at him. "Yesterday, for the first time in decades, I felt seen. Not as an empress, just Lyra." Jaren didn't know what to say, so he said the only honest thing he could. "I'm glad I could help." She laughed. A light, musical sound that startled a flock of desert birds into flight. "You did more than help. You reminded me why I fight. Not for territory, but for people like you. People who share their last meal with a stranger." Over the next few days, the Kesari forces withdrew in an orderly retreat. Terran scouts confirmed it. Not a single shot fired, not a trap left behind. The war on Varellon Prime was over, not with a bang, but with a shared lunch. But Jaren didn't return to base with the others. Lyravis invited him aboard her flagship, the Dawn Chariot, a vessel so vast it housed entire gardens and libraries within its hull. At first, he refused. "I'm just a soldier," he said. "You're the man who fed an empress," she replied. "That makes you more than just a soldier. It makes you a bridge." So he went. The Dawn Chariot was nothing like the cramped, utilitarian ships of the Terran fleet. Its corridors glowed with soft light, its walls embedded with living flora that filtered the air and hummed with quiet energy. Lyravis gave him chambers near the observation deck, where he could watch stars streak past in silent ballet. Their days fell into an easy rhythm. In the mornings, he'd train with Kesari warriors, learning their forms, sharing earth martial arts in return. In the afternoons, he'd sit with Lyravis in her solarium, sipping spiced tea that tasted like cinnamon and starlight, talking about everything and nothing. Earth's oceans, Kesari poetry, the loneliness of command, the way a good laugh could heal wounds no medkit could touch. He learned that she'd walked the battlefield alone, disguised, to see the truth of the war with her own eyes. That the bruise on her jaw came from a Terran scout who'd nearly shot her before she knocked him out with a pressure point strike. That she'd been planning to negotiate a ceasefire for months, but her council had resisted, until a simple act of kindness gave her the moral high ground she needed. One evening, as they stood on the observation deck watching a nebula bloom in the distance, she turned to him. "What do you want, Jaren?" "Truly," he thought for a long time, "I want to build something that lasts. Not empires, not fleets, just a home. Somewhere people can be kind without fearing it makes them weak." She smiled. "Then stay." He looked at her, really looked. Beyond the Empress, beyond the power. He saw the woman who ate his ration pouch like it was a feast, who laughed at his dumb jokes, who cried once, quietly, when he told her about his younger sister who died in the Martian refugee camps. "I'll stay," he said. Months passed. Jaren became an unofficial ambassador, helping bridge the cultural chasm between Terrans and Kesari. He founded a joint medical initiative, training Terran and Kesari healers to work side by side. He even adopted a trio of Kesari orphans whose parents had died in the war, 3 rambunctious girls with violet skin, wild white hair, and endless questions about earth candy. Lyravis watched it all with quiet pride. And sometimes, late at night, she'd find him on the observation deck, staring at the stars. "Still thinking about home?" she'd ask. "Home's right here," he'd say, taking her hand. The galaxy didn't change overnight. There were still skirmishes, still tensions. But something had shifted. At the heart of the Kesari Dominion, a human soldier and an alien empress were proving that compassion could be the foundation of peace. And it all started with a lunch shared in a desert tent. 2 strangers, one bruised and one weary, offering each other something far more valuable than food: trust. Far below, on a newly rebuilt settlement on Varellon Prime, children of both species played in the sand, building castles that looked suspiciously like the Dawn Chariot. And high above, in the quiet of space, Jaren and Lyra sat together, watching the stars, and planning a future where kindness was the strongest weapon of all. The settlement they built on Varellon Prime, halfway between the Iron Scar and the old Terran forward base, came to be called Haven's Reach. It wasn't grand by galactic standards. A cluster of biodomes, fusion wells, and communal greenhouses sprouting hardy lumberries and Terran kale side by side. But to those who lived there it was more than a town. It was a promise. Jaren spent his days knee-deep in the work of building that promise. He coordinated supply runs with Terran freighters and Kesari sky barges, mediated disputes between former enemies now forced to share water purifiers, and taught basic first aid in a schoolhouse that doubled as a mess hall. The children, Terran, Kesari, even a few hybrid orphans adopted during the ceasefire, called him Uncle Jaren, a title he wore with more pride than any military commendation. Lyravis, for her part, ruled differently now. She still held court aboard the Dawn Chariot, still commanded fleets and signed treaties, but she did so with a new kind of strength, one that didn't hide vulnerability but embraced it as wisdom. She visited Haven's Reach often, slipping away from her royal retinue to walk the dusty streets in simple robes, her white hair braided with desert wildflowers the children picked for her. No one bowed anymore. They waved. They offered her tea. Sometimes they even scolded her for working too hard. It was during one such visit that the storm came, not of sand but of politics. A Kesari war faction, calling themselves the Crimson Veil, had been growing in the outer systems. They saw Lyravis's alliance with Terrans as betrayal, her peace initiatives as decay. Led by General Vraxis, a hardliner who'd once been her mentor, they began rallying disaffected governors, spreading rumors that the Empress had been softened by a human lover, that she no longer had the fire to protect Kesari purity. The first real threat arrived not with weapons, but with words. A formal challenge. In the old Kesari tradition, Vraxis invoked the right of accord, a ceremonial duel of leadership, not fought with blades, but with public trial before the High Conclave. If Lyravis refused, she would be deemed unfit. If she accepted and lost, Vraxis would take the throne. She told Jaren that night beneath the twin moons, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly as they sat on the roof of the schoolhouse, wrapped in the same thermal blanket he'd given her months ago. "They think I've forgotten who I am," she said, staring at the stars. "That you've made me weak." Jaren didn't flinch. "Then let them see the truth." "What truth?" "That you didn't choose peace because you're weak. You chose it because you're strong enough to imagine something better." She turned to him, golden eyes shimmering. "And if I lose? Then we build something better anyway," he said simply. "With or without thrones." She laughed, though tears clung to her lashes. "You still give away your last ration, don't you? Only when it matters." The conclave was held in the crystal spire of Kessanine, the ancestral heart of the Dominion. Jaren wasn't allowed to attend, he was non-Kesari, and the rite forbade outsiders, but Lyravis insisted he come to the planet anyway. "Wait in the lower gardens," she whispered before she entered the spire. "If I don't come out, you'll know what to do." He waited for 3 days. During that time, rumors flew like shrapnel. Some said Vraxis had already declared victory. Others claimed Lyravis had vanished. On the third night, a cloaked figure appeared at the edge of the garden. A young Kesari scribe, eyes wide with fear. "They're going to execute her," the scribe gasped. Vraxis twisted the verdict, called her a traitor for consorting with Terrans. "They're taking her to the Eclipse platform at dawn." Jaren didn't hesitate. He'd smuggled a pulse pistol in his belt and a stolen access chip tucked in his boot. Gifts from sympathetic Kesari guards who still believed in their Empress. With the scribe's help, he bypassed the outer sentries, slipped through maintenance tunnels older than the spire itself, and reached the Eclipse platform just as the sky began to bleed crimson. Lyravis stood at the center, bound in energy manacles that crackled with suppressant fields, her ceremonial robes torn, her face bruised, but her spine unbent. Vraxis loomed over her, armored in crimson plate, his voice booming across the platform. "Behold, the Empress who fed on human scraps and forgot the fire of our ancestors." Jaren stepped out from the shadows. "I fed her 1 meal," he said, loud enough for every guard to hear. "You've been feeding her lies your whole life." Silence, then chaos. Guards surged toward him, but Jaren was already moving, years of battlefield instinct kicking in. He disabled the first 2 with quick neural taps, used their fallen rifles to short-circuit the energy field around Lyravis, and tossed her a pistol he'd palmed from a third. She caught it without looking, her eyes blazing with something he'd never seen before. Not just regal authority, but righteous fury. "You gave me back my voice," she said to him as they stood back to back, surrounded. "No," he said, grinning despite the danger. "You never lost it. You just needed someone to remind you it mattered." What followed wasn't a battle, it was a reckoning. Lyravis didn't kill Vraxis. She disarmed him, then stood over him as the conclave elders emerged, drawn by the commotion. "He speaks of purity," she declared, voice ringing across the platform. "But purity without compassion is just another kind of tyranny." She activated the Spire's central broadcast. Every Kasari world, every Terran outpost, every neutral system tuned in. "I do not rule because I am flawless," she said, turning to face the galaxy. "I rule because I choose to listen, because I choose to feed the hungry, even if they wear another uniform, because I choose to build bridges, not graves." Then she pointed to Jaren. "This man is not my weakness. He is my witness. He showed me that strength isn't measured in conquest, but in care." The conclave, shamed and awed, reinstated her by unanimous decree. Vraxis was stripped of rank and exiled, not to a prison, but to Haven's Reach, where Lyravis assigned him to work in the orphanage. "Let him learn what we're really fighting for," she said. Afterward, as they flew back to Varellon Prime aboard a small shuttle, Lyravis leaned her head on Jaren's shoulder. "You risked everything for me," she murmured. "You'd have done the same," he replied. "I would," she said. "And I will. Always." Life in Haven's Reach deepened after that. The town grew. New families arrived. Terrans disillusioned with the Alliance's cold pragmatism. Kasari tired of endless war. Even exiles from fringe species seeking neutrality. Jaren and Lyravis married not in a grand ceremony, but in the greenhouse, surrounded by the children they'd adopted and the neighbors who'd become family. The officiant was a retired Terran medic and a Kasari botanist, both holding hands as they spoke the vows. They didn't call it a royal wedding. They called it a promise, renewed daily in shared meals, quiet walks, and the way Lyravis would leave council meetings early just to watch Jaren teach the girls how to throw a proper punch. But peace, they were learning, was not a destination. It was a practice. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the twin suns dip below the dunes, one of the girls, Mira, the eldest, rushed up, breathless. "Uncle Jaren, Aunt Lyra, you have to see this." They followed her to the edge of town, where a ship unlike any they'd seen before hovered silently above the sand. Sleek, organic in shape, its hull shimmering like mother of pearl. A ramp lowered, and from it stepped 3 figures. Green-skinned, orange-haired, dressed in flowing desert silks. "We come in peace," the tallest said, bowing deeply. "We heard of Haven's Reach, of a human who shares his food, and an empress who listens." Jaren exchanged a glance with Lyra. She smiled, that soft, knowing smile that had first disarmed him in a triage tent. "Looks like we've got more mouths to feed," he said. "And more hearts to welcome," she added. As the newcomers approached, hesitant but hopeful, Jaren walked forward, hands open, no weapons, no titles, just a man who knew the weight of kindness. "Welcome," he said. "Dinner's almost ready." Behind him, Lyravis watched, her golden eyes warm with pride. The galaxy was vast, broken in places, still healing. But here, in this desert cradle of dust and dreams, something new was growing. Not an empire, not a treaty, but a home. And it all began with a lunch. The green-skinned visitors introduced themselves as sisters from the Orlani Collective, a matriarchal society of desert nomads whose homeworld had been scorched during the early phase of the Kesari-Terran conflict. Their people had scattered across the rim systems, living in cloaked skiffs and bartering salvage tech for water. They'd heard whispers of a place where enemies broke bread together, where a human and an empress raised orphans under twin suns, and where no one asked your bloodline before offering you shelter. Their names were Tesha, Nyla, and Kira. Tesha, the eldest, spoke for them all. "We do not come to beg," she said, though her eyes flickered with hunger. "We come to belong." Jaren offered them beds in the guest dome that night and stew made from lumberries, Terran lentils, and Kesari root mash, a dish that had become Haven's Reach's unofficial anthem of unity. As they ate, Lyravis studied them not as potential threats or political liabilities, but as people. She noticed how Nyla quietly gave her share of protein crumbles to the youngest orphan at the table, how Kira's fingers trembled when she spoke of their mother, lost in a bombing raid over Orla 5. The next morning, Tesha approached Jaren as he repaired a water recycler near the Western Dome. "In our culture," she said carefully, "when a man shows kindness to strangers, especially during lean times, it is seen as a sign of worthiness." Jaren wiped grease from his hands, wary. "Okay." She took a deep breath. "We would ask, humbly, if you would consider taking us as wives." Silence. Jaren blinked. You what? Tesh's cheeks flushed a deeper green. It is not a demand. Only an honor we would offer. Our people believe that a man who shares his last meal is a man who will never let his family starve. Before Jaren could stammer a reply, Lyravis appeared beside him, arms crossed, an amused glint in her golden eyes. He's already married, she said, voice smooth as velvet. Tesha bowed her head. We know. But among the Orlani, marriage is not always singular. A strong household may have many hearts, if all consent. Lyra's expression softened. She stepped forward, placing a hand on Tesh's shoulder. You misunderstand. He's not just married, he's mine. And I don't share. A beat passed. Then Jaren coughed. Half laugh, half choke. But wait, that's not. Lyravis turned to him, eyebrow arched. Unless you'd like to explain to 3 grieving sisters that their offer, while deeply honorable, is utterly impossible because your empress has claimed you like a dragon hoarding treasure? He stared at her. You're jealous. I'm possessive, she corrected without shame. And practical. We already have 3 daughters. Adding 3 wives might stretch even my patience. The Orlani sisters exchanged glances, then burst into soft laughter. The kind that came from relief, not rejection. We meant no disrespect, Tesha said, smiling. Only to honor you both. Lyravis nodded. Then honor us by staying. Not as wives, but as sisters. Teach our children your songs. Help us rebuild your people's seed vaults. Make Haven your home. And so they did. The Orlani sisters brought with them ancient knowledge of underground aquifers, desert grafting techniques, and a dialect of sonic weaving that could strengthen dome membranes against sandstorms. In return, they found safety, purpose, and something they hadn't dared hope for. Belonging. Weeks turned to months. Haven's reach swelled to over 200 souls. Terrans, Kesari, Orlani, and even a stray Signoran botanist who'd crash-landed during a meteor shower and never left. Jaren and Lyravis presided not as rulers, but as anchors, the steady hands around which a new society could form. Yet peace, as they'd learned, was never static. One afternoon, as Jaren taught Mira how to calibrate a solar inverter, a warning chime echoed through the settlement. Not an attack, not yet, but an incoming priority hail on the secure Kesari channel. Lyravis appeared moments later, her face unreadable. It's the Terran High Command, she said. They've declared Haven's reach a breach of sovereignty. They're sending a fleet. Jaren's blood ran cold. Why? Because we're working with former enemies. Because we're thriving outside their control. Because, she added bitterly, peace without permission is still rebellion. That night, they held a council in the central dome. Everyone came, the elders, the children, even Vraxis, who now spent his days tending the greenhouse with grim focus. Voices rose and fell. Fear, anger, resolve. We can't fight them, said an old Terran engineer. They'll glass the whole plateau. We don't have to fight, Lyravis replied. She stood, regal even in her simple tunic. We show them what they're about to destroy. She activated the planetary broadcast, the same system she'd used during the conclave, and opened all channels. For 3 days straight, Haven's reach lived openly under the gaze of the approaching Terran fleet. Children played in mixed groups. Kesari healers treated Terran elders. Orlani weavers sang while mending solar sails. Jaren taught a class on non-lethal defense. Lyravis read bedtime stories to a circle of wide-eyed kids of every species. On the 3rd night, the fleet arrived, 6 heavy cruisers, ominous against the star-dusted sky. But they didn't fire. Instead, a single shuttle detached and landed at the edge of town. Out stepped Admiral Cora Rennick, Jaren's former commanding officer, the woman who'd once pinned a medal on his chest after the Battle of Helios Gorge. She walked alone, unarmed, her face lined with war and weariness. Jaren Vale, she said when she reached him. You've caused quite a stir. He nodded. We just wanted to live in peace, ma'am. She looked past him, at the domes lit with warm light, at the children chasing fireflies, at Lyravis standing calmly beside him, her hand resting on the head of a sleeping orphan. I came to shut this down, Rennick admitted, but I've been watching your broadcast, and I saw something I haven't seen in 20 years of service. What's that? Jaren asked. Hope that isn't a trick. She turned to Lyravis. Your Majesty, you've built something here, not a base, not a colony, a home. Lyravis inclined her head. We offer you one too, if you're tired of fighting. Rennick laughed, a rough, broken sound. I am. Gods, I am. The fleet didn't leave that day. Instead, it parked in high orbit. For observation, Rennick claimed. But within a week, engineers from the lead cruiser were trading tools with Haven's Reach mechanics. Medics swapped trauma protocols. And one young Terran pilot, barely older than Mira, shyly asked if he could stay. The High Command would eventually issue reprimands, demand reports, threaten sanctions. But by then, Haven's Reach was no longer just a settlement. It was a movement. And at its heart stood Jaren and Lyravis, still sharing meals, still holding hands under the stars, still building a world where kindness was the first language. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the girls chase a holographic butterfly Tesha had conjured for them, Lyravis leaned her head on Jaren's shoulder. "Do you ever miss Earth?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said. "But I found something better." "What's that?" "A future that includes you." She smiled, her golden eyes catching the last light of dusk. "Then we'll keep building it. One lunch, one life, one act of stubborn kindness at a time." And in the quiet desert night, with the hum of fusion wells and children's laughter drifting on the wind, it felt like enough. More than enough. Felt like the beginning of everything. Years later, under a sky stitched with stars from 100 worlds, Jaren and Lyravis renewed their vows. Not in robes or regalia, but in worn work clothes, hands calloused from building, healing, and holding their children. Around them stood not just the 3 girls they'd first adopted, but 7 more, Terran, Kasari, Orlani, and 2 whose heritage no one could quite name, found alone in the ruins of forgotten wars. Their home, now a sprawling compound of domes and gardens, echoed with laughter, squabbles, bedtime stories, and the clatter of shared meals. Lyravis still ruled the Dominion, but only from afar, her decrees now written between helping little Rian with math and braiding Zeevi's wild hair. Jaren taught defense, yes, but more often, he taught kindness, showing every child how to mend a broken toy, share a blanket, or say "I'm sorry" without shame. Their marriage wasn't perfect. Some nights they argued over water rations or school curricula, but they always ended in the same place. Side by side on the porch, watching the twin moons rise. The galaxy still burned in places, but Haven's Reach became a beacon, a living proof that peace wasn't the absence of war, but the presence of care. They never sought to be legends. They only wanted to be parents, partners, and neighbors. And in doing so, they became something greater, the quiet architects of a new kind of empire, one built not on conquest, but on lunch shared in a desert tent long ago. Their children would one day lead, not with swords but with open hands. And every night, without fail, Jaren still offered Lyravis the last bite of his meal. She always refused, pressing it back to his lips with a smile. "You fed me when I was nobody," she'd whisper. "Now let me feed you, my love." And in that simple exchange, the whole future bloomed.